William McKinley enters American history with the light behind him rather than in his face. A small-town son with a soldier's steadiness, a lawyer's patience, and a politician's ear tuned not for applause, but for the faint crackle that runs through a country when prosperity is possible again. He is born in Niles, Ohio, in 1843, into a household that believes work is a sacrament, and education the shortest road between a wish and its fulfillment. He is not a prodigy, he is dependable. At Poland Seminary, he learns the grammar of argument, the usefulness of quiet, and the art of listening long enough to hear what people actually mean beneath what they say. When the war comes, he enlists without embroidery, a private in the 23rd Ohio, and discovers in the field that courage often looks like carrying hot coffee to a forward post under fire, because men fight better when they are warm. Antietam imprints him. So does the winter that follows. So do the promotions earned not by brilliance, but by being where he is supposed to be, doing the thing that needs doing. By the end, he wears an officer's straps and the settled look of someone who has watched chaos and decided never again to make a mess where order will suffice. He reads law in Youngstown and Canton, sets up a practice, and begins the long apprenticeship of local office that teaches a man the price of everything he will later sign. He becomes prosecuting attorney for Stark County. He learns that fairness is a habit rather than a posture. He marries Ida Saxton, whose beauty, wit, and later fragility will become the private weather system through which he navigates his public years. The couple loses 2 daughters in infancy. Ida's health, shaken and never fully restored, becomes the constant he protects with a tenderness the country will eventually notice in the way he arranges chairs and schedules around her comfort. Out of grief grows a discipline. McKinley, who could have become brittle, becomes gentle and meticulous, and that temperament will make him, paradoxically, a formidable executive, because he understands that stability is an achievement, not a default. Congress is his next school. Elected in 1876, he spends 14 years learning the federal machine from the tariff schedules inward, the way a machinist learns a lathe. He becomes the House's master of the protective tariff, not as dogma, but as instrument. He believes, fiercely and with the conviction of a man who has counted pay envelopes, that American wages deserve a national shield while the country finishes the leap from farms to factories. He praises competition and condemns predation. He speaks without rancor and wins converts by arithmetic. The McKinley Tariff of 1890, his signature as a legislator, raises protective rates to heights that thrill mill towns and chill kitchen tables. It includes a reciprocity lever that will later become important, allowing the executive to bargain duties downward from high ground. The bill helps cost him his seat when voters punish Republicans for dearer goods. He does not sulk. He runs for governor of Ohio in 1891 and wins, then again in 1893, becoming the rare figure who can appear both as a friend of business and an advocate for the worker, because he actually likes both, and because in his voice there is none of the contempt that so often poisons rhetoric about class. Governor McKinley vetoes where he must and signs where he can, stabilizing a state pitched by the Panic of 1893. His views harden against the silver inflationists who promise relief by diluting money's meaning. He sees in their program a kindness that ends cruelly. Prices can rise, but so can rent. Wages can be paid, but in lighter coin. The poor, he believes, are hurt most by a currency that once again becomes a rumor. Mark Hanna, the industrialist politician whose friendship with McKinley becomes one of American politics' most practical partnerships, looks at the country in 1896 and sees a corridor through which his friend can walk to the presidency. A front porch campaign that turns Canton into a national parlor, high tariff and gold standard as the twin pillars of respectable growth. Calm voice against the rolling thunder of William Jennings Bryan's Silver Crusade. McKinley agrees to be himself in public, which is the hardest thing a candidate can do. Delegations arrive by train. He speaks in careful paragraphs about money and work, about prosperity earned rather than willed, about a broad market for American products that will pay for American wages. Ida sits inside, sometimes present, sometimes absent, always considered. Bryan tours the continent like a revivalist. McKinley lets the continent tour him. The result is not close in the only arithmetic that matters, the electoral kind. The country wants quiet courage. The presidency he builds is modern not because it roars, but because it hums. He chooses a cabinet that is less an echo chamber than a well-stocked workshop. Lyman Gage at Treasury, a banker with a reformer's mien. John Sherman at State, an aging lion whose presence steadies the first months, while younger men, above all William R. Day and soon John Hay, prepare to write the new diplomacy. Russell Alger at War, later replaced by Elihu Root, whose genius for administration will become one of the age's great gifts. McKinley's method is to chair the government rather than to declaim at it. He listens, decides, and then walks the decision through Congress with a patience that makes allies of men who began as skeptics. The Dingley Tariff of 1897 resets protection at heights designed to comfort factories and revenue at levels designed to keep the Treasury solvent. It restores reciprocity as an active instrument, authorizing negotiations that will be the first drafts of a more confident commercial policy. He signs the Gold Standard Act of 1900 and considers it more housekeeping than heraldry. To him, the act codifies what the election settled. The dollar is a promise the world can trust. Confidence returns not instantly, but steadily. Credit loosens. New industries discover the arithmetic they require to risk. Old industries discover that discipline can coexist with profit. He does not gloat. He simply keeps lowering the country's pulse until millions can sleep without listening for the sound of a bank door closing early. Then the great interruption arrives in the form of Cuba, Spain, and a century's worth of accumulated American impatience with European imperial decay in our hemisphere. Cuban rebels have been fighting for independence. Spanish reconcentration policies produce suffering that spills into American newspapers. Public sympathy hardens into fury. The battleship Maine explodes in Havana Harbor, and although the cause is not conclusively Spanish, the fire that has been waiting for a spark has one. McKinley is not a man in search of a war. He resists the howl, explores autonomy plans, sends notes, prays over the arithmetic of casualties, but he is also a realist about democracy. There is a point beyond which prudence sounds like cowardice and patience looks like indifference. In April 1898, he asks Congress for authority to intervene. The resolution recognizes Cuban independence and disavows annexation. It also makes fighting inevitable. The war that follows is brief, clumsy in places, and decisive. Dewey's squadron in Manila Bay shatters a Spanish fleet at dawn like a porcelain cupboard hit with a hammer. On the heights above Santiago de Cuba, regulars and volunteers, among them the Rough Riders, climb into a storm of fire that becomes legend. Disease kills more men than bullets, as disease always does in the 19th century when doctors still carry too many old certainties in their bags. By August, Spain sues for peace. The Treaty of Paris in December 1898 redraws the map of American possibility and conscience. Puerto Rico and Guam come to the United States. Spain renounces claim to Cuba. The Philippines, purchased for $20 million, become the hinge of a national debate about empire. McKinley's own mind travels a path he later describes without flourish. He prays, he studies. He rejects simple alternatives, returning the islands to Spain, delivering them to a hurried independence under warlords, or handing them to another empire. He concludes that the United States must assume responsibility, prepare the Filipinos for self-government, and treat the archipelago not as a trophy, but as a ward. He uses the phrase benevolent assimilation, which reads better in a sermon than it does in a village where strangers now write the ordinances. Filipino revolutionaries who had fought Spain do not accept a new master. Insurrection breaks. The Philippine-American War begins as a bitter, complicated struggle of ambush, counterinsurgency, and mutual incomprehension. McKinley chooses generals who can learn and administrators, later men like William Howard Taft, who treat education, sanitation, and civil service as the tools of a gradualist plan. He believes honestly that Republican tutelage is better than chaos. Opponents, some principled and some political, believe that any tutelage contradicts American principles. The Anti-Imperialist League gathers under moral banners. The administration explains, negotiates, and fights. Casualties mount, reforms advance, and the war, never formally declared, never theatrically concluded, slowly turns from fire to ember. In the islands, schools open and resentment simmers. In the United States, a new word, expansion, turns from accusation into descriptor. In the Caribbean, the problem of Cuba becomes the problem of how to keep a promise. The United States occupies, cleans, vaccinates, and builds. It prepares to leave. The Platt Amendment, passed in 1901, writes conditions into Cuba's sovereignty. No treaties that compromise independence, no public debt beyond means, American right to intervene to preserve order, and the lease of naval stations that read to some like guardianship and to others like a chain. McKinley supports the formula as the least bad device for honoring independence while preventing a relapse into a European invitation. It is a lawyer's compromise in a revolutionary neighborhood. For Puerto Rico, the Foraker Act establishes a civilian government under American authority. The insular cases begin to tell the Supreme Court's story of what it means to own a territory that is neither a state nor foreign. McKinley does not choreograph the court. He accepts and helps devise the language of unincorporated territories, constitutional rights in part, Congress's plenary powers in part, because he believes flexibility is necessary while institutions are being invented. In China, he supports John Hay's open door notes, insisting that all powers respect commercial equality and China's territorial integrity. When the Boxer Rebellion erupts, American troops join an international relief expedition. After victory, the United States urges moderation in indemnities and uses part of China's eventual payments to fund scholarships for Chinese students. It is a small, remarkable precedent, power expressed with restraint, and restraint coupled to a tangible benevolence. Through these years, McKinley's domestic hand never stops arranging the furniture of prosperity. He sponsors reciprocity agreements under the Dingley framework, translating his old tariff art into a new trade diplomacy. He tends to the civil service with a reformer's patience, expanding classifications so competence survives changes in party weather. He backs currency stability as a precondition for all the other ambitions. He does not pretend trusts are angels. He does not demonize them as devils. His view is administrative. Use antitrust law where combinations crush competition. Use publicity and policy where size simply reflects modern production. Nourish the farmer with markets, the worker with wages, and the nation with predictability. He believes in growth without humiliation. He dislikes rhetoric that finds enemies inside the economy and then sells the pleasure of denouncing them. He is, in this sense, the last 19th century president and the first 20th century executive. He builds a staff structure inside the White House that looks forward more than backward, corrals cabinet departments into coherence, uses the press not as a vanity mirror, but as a bulletin board, and treats public opinion with respect rather than fear. He is also a husband who never forgets the chair he has kept near his desk for Ida. The country sees him adjust schedules to her comfort, hold her hand when an episode sweeps over her in public, and rise from a table to steady her when others would pretend not to notice. These small gestures, repeated, educate a nation about tenderness. They also tell you something about his inner engine. The same patience that can carry a bill through a balky house can carry a frightened woman through a bad hour. Re-election in 1900 arrives on the back of prosperity and victory. Bryan runs again, with anti-imperialism added to silver, and makes eloquent arguments about the contradictions of liberty achieved abroad, while some liberties at home still struggle for air. McKinley answers with experience, predictability, and the promise of continued growth. He keeps Theodore Roosevelt on the ticket, a vice presidential candidate chosen to solve New York problems, who will, through a tragedy, inherit a national opportunity. The vote goes easily for the incumbents. McKinley takes the result not as a triumph to preen over, but as permission to continue a program he believes is working. He begins the second term with a speech in Buffalo on September 5, 1901, at the Pan American Exposition. It is a sermon on reciprocity, a plea for more trade and fewer walls, an argument that strength and generosity are not enemies. The next day, while receiving the public in the Temple of Music, he extends his hand to a man, whose other hand hides a pistol in a bandage. 2 shots. One grazes his breastbone, the other enters his abdomen and tears what surgeons of the hour cannot adequately repair. For 8 days, the nation keeps vigil. Newspapers produce bulletins each hour, and the modern presidency learns the rhythm of national suspense. He dies on September 14, after whispering a hymn his mother loved. He is 58. Roosevelt takes the oath in Buffalo. What remains is not a single emblem, but a fabric. McKinley leaves behind a currency that does not wobble, a tariff policy designed not simply to protect, but to bargain. A government shifted toward an executive center that can coordinate a continental economy. A navy that is no longer an afterthought. An overseas footprint that will stretch the country's conscience for a century. A habit of reciprocity and arbitration that converts swagger into law. A civil service that can survive elections without bleeding competence. And a tone, calm, courteous, stubbornly hopeful, that has the odd effect of making later flamboyant presidencies look like costume changes tried on by a republic still wearing his shoes. He is not a crusader, he is an arranger. And arrangement in a nation as large and various as the United States in 1900 is not a timid art. It is governing's most difficult craft. His critics are not fools. They point to the Philippines and see the birth of contradictions that will dog American policy in every decade to come. The language of liberation, coupled with the practice of occupation, the promise of education alongside the presence of bayonets, the slow graduation of a people to the rights that Americans claim as birthrights. They point to Cuba and see a string tied to a new flag. They hear open door and detect the scent of commerce rationalized into mission. They are right, in part. McKinley's belief that American tutelage could be a bridge rather than a jailer's walk was sincere, but not self-fulfilling. Its success depended on administrators' decency and on time's generosity. Where both were present, it helped. Where either failed, resentment bloomed. Yet, his defenders are not merely apologists. They point to the administrative reforms in Manila and the schools, to moderation after the Boxer Rebellion, to commercial treaties that raised wages in towns that had forgotten what a raise felt like, to a political style that refused spectacle as a substitute for substance, to the creation of habits inside the federal government that made later progressive reforms possible by providing a chassis that would not collapse under the load. He is, in the end, the most underestimated kind of American leader. The one who understands that prosperity is a language the Republic speaks when it is not shouting. He knows how to make law and diplomacy rhyme. He knows when to yield a phrase to a senator to gain a vote that matters more than the phrase. He knows how to say no without humiliation and yes without intoxication. He believes citizens want decency more than drama, and he behaves accordingly, which is why contemporaries often mistake his calm for absence. But look at the ledger lines from 1897 to 1901, and you see the signature everywhere, on money that keeps its promise, on a tariff that becomes a tool rather than a theology, on ships laid down that will protect commerce for decades, on treaties whose small clauses become strong customs, on appointments that turn departments into instruments, on a diplomatic memorandum that keeps doors open in a continent Americans barely understand, on a war insisted upon by opinion but concluded with moderation, and finally, on a sentence about trade in Buffalo that reads like a last benediction. We can sell to the world and buy from it without losing ourselves. Imagine him late at night in the White House, a tray sent back untouched because Ida has had a better hour and he prefers to sit with her until the nurse arrives. On his desk, a draft of a reciprocity treaty with a Latin republic that would add 3 cents a day to the pay of a Midwestern packer and cost no one a job. A Navy requisition meeting only a signature and the thought of boys who will serve on that hull. A report from Manila counting schools opened and patrols ambushed. A memo from Hay about the next circular to the powers concerning China. The commas placed like sandbags against misinterpretation. A letter from a widow in Ohio enclosing a newspaper clipping from 1864 and a plea for a pension she has somehow missed. A note in his own hand to be delivered in the morning to an old comrade who has fallen on thin times. He decides, annotates, signs, and before he blows out the lamp, pauses for a moment at the open window to listen to the city he has made a little quieter. He does not think of greatness. He thinks of sufficiency. He thinks, as he always has, of the country as a house he has been hired to keep clean, warm, and paid for, so that strangers in distant rooms can sleep. He understood that politics is less a parade than a sequence of hard accommodations, and that victory, misread as a blank check, quickly turns into a bill. After 1900, he used the time that a second mandate buys to tighten bolts he had only been able to set by hand in the first. He asked Congress for broader reciprocity authority and received less than he wanted, but more than nothing. He nudged the civil service further from the reach of precinct captains. He kept the dollar's definition stable enough that men who once hoarded coin now banked paper without glancing over their shoulders at rumors. He listened to farmers who had learned that prosperity requires rail rates as much as rainfall. He listened to manufacturers who had learned that a tariff must be an instrument, not an idol. He listened to labor leaders who had learned that strikes, invented to shame the indifferent, could backfire when managers had found lawyers willing to turn injunctions into manacles. He did not grandstand. He made plans. The country, which had spent a decade and a half oscillating between austerity and appetite, registered the change the way a family registers a careful father's presence in the next room. The voices in the house drop. The chores get done. The children go to sleep earlier and wake easier. In foreign affairs, the brushwork grew finer. John Hay stayed at state and made the open-door policy more than a metaphor, suggesting that American power would be best served by a habit of rules that advantaged commerce without spoiling sovereignty. The Boxer aftermath required that tone to be proven in money as well as in speech. McKinley backed Hay's insistence that the indemnity demanded by victorious powers not become a humiliation that would poison the very stability everyone claimed to desire. The compromise that emerged, payment reduced in spirit and, in America's case, repurposed to fund scholarships, was not charity disguised. It was strategy placed in a decent frame. In the Caribbean, he continued to balance the promise made to Cuba with the fear that absence would invite mischief. Military authorities gave way to civilians. Sanitation campaigns turned tropical filth into manageable danger. Tariffs were adjusted to soothe planters without surrendering leverage. The flag prepared to leave but left behind a knot tied to a clause. He did not experience the contradiction as hypocrisy. He experienced it as prudence in a place where prudence is the only virtue citizens forgive when it disappoints ideals. Hawaii, annexed in 1898, demanded something different: statecraft as school administration. The islands were layered with businesses, missions, and families who had convinced themselves they were destiny's instruments. He replaced martial oversight with civil structure and refused to pretend that annexation had been an act of pure inspiration. Governors were told to respect law rather than merely enforce practice. Courts were staffed with men who could read more than plantation ledgers. The logic of citizenship began to creep along roads that had long been posted with private signs. Puerto Rico required another kind of attention. Under the Foraker framework, McKinley chose officers who would treat the island neither as a colony to be exploited, nor as a charity case to be indulged. Customs were adjusted, schools reorganized, public health modernized. The pace offended both those who wanted instant equality and those who preferred permanent subordination. He was content to offend both, because he had decided that durable arrangements were the only arrangements worth the time it takes to build them. At home, he watched the future arriving disguised as convenience. The trust question remained, as ever, a problem with too many easy answers. He was not seduced by rhetoric that treated size as sin. He was not blinded by arguments that treated efficiency as absolution. The law he had inherited, the skeletal Sherman Act, was a tool, and tools matter less for their beauty than for the hands that wield them. Where combinations bullied competitors or turned markets into toll roads, he signaled prosecutors to act. Where combinations merely produced at a scale that made goods cheaper and wages steadier, he asked regulators and legislators to be thoughtful rather than theatrical. His instinct was administrative rather than punitive. Publish, investigate, negotiate, and then punish when negotiation revealed the contempt that makes punishment useful. That instinct would become under his successor more muscular, Under McKinley, it was the quiet tone of a government that had just discovered it could distinguish between power used and power abused. He also recognized that the presidency itself was changing, and he did not resist. For a century, presidents had behaved as if the office were a writing desk attached by long corridors to separate fiefdoms called departments. McKinley brought those corridors into his room. He chaired his cabinet like a board, not to diminish strong secretaries, but to align them. He created the habits that would, later, be institutionalized into staff systems, daily briefings, cross-departmental assignments, long-range planning that measured policy by seasons instead of by headlines. He managed Congress as a partner, rather than a rival, telling floor leaders what he needed and listening long enough to be told what they could deliver. He curated public opinion, not by chasing its winds, but by facing them and speaking into them in sentences that neither patronized nor pandered. He showed that an executive can be strong without spectacle, influential without insult, modern without preening. His private style reinforced his public method. He rose early, read long, and avoided the theatrical sulk that passes in Washington for profundity. He guarded Ida's comfort with a devotion that taught clerks and colonels alike that tenderness is not a weakness in a man who can sign orders that send ships into harm's way. He had a memory for names and small favors that made strangers feel seen. He worked through lunches because talking while eating had become the capital's favorite way to pretend productivity. He preferred one thing at a time. He was a partisan without enemies, which is to say, he believed that the point of winning was not to humiliate the losers, but to give the country a governing plan. He carried in his pocket the faces of the dead he had known as a young soldier, and he treated veterans not as a voting bloc, but as a moral category that deserved administrative competence, rather than melted sentimentality. He was not witty, he was warm. People around him produced their better selves because he made shabby behavior feel out of tune with the room. The assassination was less a plot than a pathology. A lone man mistaking grievance for mission and finding in the new practice of public receptions an access point democracy had always cherished and never learned to fully protect. The fair in Buffalo celebrated light, industry, speed, and the cheerful certainty that the hemisphere's future would be a market held together by rails and wires. It was a good place for an American president to deliver a homily about interdependence. It was an awful place for a pistol and a bandage. After the shots, the same technological confidence that he had just praised performed a tragic vaudeville of half-knowledge. X-rays were not deployed. The best surgeons were late. Antisepsis standards, still uneven among American practitioners, were not applied with the severity European journals had been preaching for 2 decades. The president's own optimism, he who had calmed the nation, calmed his doctors into mistakes of caution and custom. The nation learned a cruel lesson about the speed with which modernity can be trumped by habit. He forgave, in pain, because that is what his character did when confronted with human limits. He blessed his friends and worried about Ida. He died into a hymn. The abolition of one life opened the second life of another. Roosevelt became the executive the age's energy had been summoning, and in many ways enacted what McKinley had carefully prepared: a stronger White House, a more insistent federal mediator between capital and labor, a larger diplomacy backed by ships McKinley had ordered, and tax receipts his tariff system had made reliable. The story of the early 20th century that schoolchildren memorize: trust-busting, canal building, national parks, and hemispheric swagger, stands on a floor McKinley laid. That is not a diminution of his successor. It is a description of continuity. The country turned toward a more extroverted voice after it had learned under McKinley to sleep without nightmares and to earn without feeling the ground give way under its feet. His reputation, like his voice, is quieter than his achievements. Enthusiasts for rhetoric sometimes miss him because he preferred sentences that sound like clear water running, rather than like horns. Critics miss him because they mistake steadiness for absence and strategy for drift. Detractors from the left make a single word, empire, carry a moral freight that obscures the ambiguities he recognized and tried to mitigate. That the Philippines were not a blank page, that independence is not an event, but a curriculum, that the same ships that carry schoolbooks carry orders, that sometimes the choice is between imperfect tutelage and a different empire's appetite. Detractors from the right, then and later, grumble that he did not love greatness loudly enough, that he compromised too easily, that he wore moderation like a medal. They would have preferred a fist. He preferred a handshake. The Republic, a society of fists tempered by handshakes, needed him when it did. To take the proper measure of his presidency, set beside it 4 ledgers. In the first ledger, mark the economy's pulse. Prices steadied, credit lengthened, employment spread, wages inched upward, and investment regained its courage without losing its discipline. He knitted tariff policy, reciprocity, and a gold definition into a framework that gave merchants the ability to plan and workers the confidence to spend. In the second ledger, mark the state's skeleton, cabinet cohesion transformed from rhetoric into daily practice. Civil service lines thickened. The House and Senate learned again how to work with an executive who did not demand humiliation as the price of cooperation. The courts were invited to interpret new questions about territories and commerce because an administration had raised those questions carefully enough to reach them intact. In the third ledger, mark the Republic's posture in the world. The Navy's steel replaced sentimental wood. Diplomacy learned to say, rule, with a small r and a plural, rules, rather than a singular. Arbitration became a habit rather than a hope. The United States learned, sometimes clumsily and sometimes well, to act abroad like a grown nation that knows the difference between appetite and responsibility. In the fourth ledger, mark the tone. The presidency practiced patience. The newspapers, deprived of rage on command, filled their columns with work. The public learned again to distinguish between excitement and progress. There were genuine failures. The Philippine War's brutal episodes, prisoners mistreated, villages punished harshly, officers loaning counterinsurgency in real time with real blood, stained the story and demanded inquiries that the administration ordered and the army, in part, conducted honestly. The racial order at home did not budge under his hand. It would be generous to say that his time permitted little, and accurate to say that a larger imagination might have insisted harder. The trust policy, careful by design, may have permitted a few too many combinations to consolidate power that later required louder correction. And the architecture of imperial law, the insular doctrine carving territories into gradations of belonging, left an inheritance that both insulated Americans from sudden obligations and denied full membership to people the flag had enveloped, an ambivalence that would complicate consciences for a century. He knew ambivalence, but he did not solve it. It is unfair to demand that he do so. It is fair to notice the line where his cautions became limits. He left, nevertheless, a country better able to carry the heavier future. You can hear it in the factory whistle that signals a second shift because orders are reliable, not because speculators have learned a new trick. You can hear it in the quiet on farms where mortgages stop barking at bedtime because credit has relaxed. You can hear it in the language of accountants, customs agents, quartermasters, and clerks whose jobs became less corruptible because a president insisted on competence and habit. You can see it in the maps of the Navy Department and the ledgers of exporters, in the papers of teachers in Manila, in the receipts of barbers in Havana, in the minutes of chambers of commerce from Seattle to Savannah, where men who once planned by months began to plan by years. You can see it in the face of a woman in a White House chair who knew she could walk into a reception where her nerves might betray her and still be loved, because the man at the center of the room would stand without making a fuss and turn the world back into a home. On the last morning he spoke publicly, he said something that might as well be the epigraph for his career. He argued that the way forward for the United States was through wider markets, fairer exchanges, and the recognition that buying and selling are not sins, but forms of mutual confidence. The sentence reads like arithmetic. Inside the arithmetic is an ethics. Let your strength be useful to others, and it will not decay. Let your prosperity be available to others, and it will multiply. Let your laws be credible, and your promises will be believed. That outlook, unromantic and quietly generous, is the one the 20th century, at its best moments, tried to learn. If the century sometimes spoke it too loudly, that is because it had forgotten the cadence of the man who first set it right. Imagine, finally, a counterfactual, not of policy, but of an evening he did not get to have. The second term is still young. He returns from Buffalo to a capital settling into September. A breeze carries the smell of late-cut grass from the mall. Ida has rested well. The cabinet comes for a working dinner. Hay with a draft of another note to the powers. Root with a chart for reorganizing staff schools and the adjutant system. Gage with a plan for a small reserve fund to be held in trust against future panics. Hitchcock with a cautious proposal to fin the most abusive timber leases while preparing a sustained policy for forest reserves. Payne with a sober memo on reciprocity modifications that could secure 3 votes in the Senate without upsetting a half dozen more. He lets them speak. He asks questions that are not traps, but tools. He decides 3 things and postpones 2. He tells a story about coffee at Antietam that makes them smile at the odd proportion of human affairs, where a hot drink can do as much for courage as a trumpet. They leave before 11. He straightens papers, sets aside a note for Ida's breakfast tray, and sleeps the satisfied sleep of a man who has measured his powers and used them without wasting any. That night did not happen. The government he had shaped made it almost unnecessary that it should. That is, in a republic, a kind of triumph. He will never be remembered as a sculptor of phrases or a breaker of idols. He belongs with the builders who make idols unnecessary by constructing rooms where people can work without praying to someone else's storm. His monument is commerce without shame, law without swagger, diplomacy without panic, administration without vanity, and the daily proof that decency scales. Walk through the archives and you will find him in memos initialed in a small, neat hand, in the instructions sent to distant officers that begin with courtesy and end with clarity, in the budgets that balance needs against means without turning either into a fetish, in the lives that did not fray because the center held. He is, to borrow the old and insufficient word, a statesman. Not because he was always right, no one is, but because he believed the state is a trust, not a stage, and behaved accordingly. He left his successor power organized, not merely acquired. He left his country readier than it had been to think and act like a nation whose strength is serviceable to others. He left his friends better men for having worked under him. He left his enemies disarmed by kindness they had not predicted. His life closed the way his sentences did, with a modesty that concealed architecture. The house he helped build still stands. When it shakes, which it will, it shakes less because of the work he did.
Midnight rails under silver moon, dusty boots on a winding road. A shadow's the only friend I've known since she packed up and let me go. Empty whiskey bottle on the seat, her laugh still echoes in my bones. Saddle's heavy with memories. I ride alone where the wind still blows. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Sunrise paints the horizon gold, but it don't warm a lonesome soul. Every town I pass feels half her size. Every trail's haunted by goodbye. I whisper prayers to open skies, hoping someday my heart'll find a brand new path beyond the pain, where broken hearts can heal in time. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be.